Hi, and welcome to week 2 of your Troy Literature course. This week we focus on exploring mainstream realism and African American realism. We're really building on the prior discussion of realism, and this also means that we're adding the African American aspects of realism to it too. The overview, as you guys reviewed, kind of focuses on understanding what realism is as far as a literary technique, and that it also is about the subject matter as well as the actual technique used. Um, you will also see that Harman and Holman reference that it is where romanticists or individuals who are writing more kind of in a philosophically optimistic way, they seek to transcend the immediate to find the ideal, and naturalists seem to really focus on the artificial, the actual or the superficial, and then of course scientific laws. Realists really do look on the here and the now, and you can see this in the readings that you focused on, both for this week and the prior week. Now, this also means that realism is a time period, and generally most of the literary scholars reference it start during the Civil War to the turn of the century. It encompassed the entire country. However, the Midwest and the South are noted for local color realism, which we will be reviewing. You're also going to see a few instances of the deep moral purpose that does pop up in the realism of not only the general or mainstream, but also the realism that pops up in African American literature. Now, as I reviewed your readings and your observations, I could see that you were doing an excellent job of engaging. I wanted to kind of start with some of the responses. Um, I do agree, as Angela mentioned, and her response, which was good. She did pull in kind of the skepticism she felt at the passing of Grandison because it's this sense of death, but when in all actuality it references to the passing or the putting off of oneself as another characteristic, another race, etc. Tina's response back to April is a little bit short, and I would recommend that you want to think about at least a paragraph, possibly two. But I do see that Tina is focused on exploring aspects from the observations. Um, Tina, you also did a fairly good job of your response. However, I can see that you need a little more evidence. Remember, for example, Harriet Beecher Stowe by Paula Lawrence Dunbar. Um, this is good that you mention it's a vivid picture, but what would be really good is maybe to have a sentence in here now that says, for instance, in the poem, and then that way you really capture of the vividness of the work. Angelica, nice response to Renee. I see that you used a little kind of saying, some to kind of capture your sense of her exploration. Uh, Shanita, decent response, but needs to be a bit more developed. However, your posting was very solid. I would recommend that you want to edit. Remember, in the weeks should own reading, so that should be apostrophe S. But that's just some nitpicky stuff. Your observations, in particular about mainstream realism and the idea of masking and unmasking, is very clever, and I appreciate your observations. Um, Now, I think Angela also did a fantastic job, and I like the way you broke it into mainstream and African American, and then kind of a conclusion at the end, which is solid. This is a good way to structure it. Remember, why we're doing this in the discussion boards is because this is what we would normally do in the classroom. We would respond back to each other, we would bring up observations and ideas and share them. And so we want to build that into our discussion boards. I really appreciate whoops, I'm sorry, let me get back here. I really appreciate Travis's observation about the folk tales particularly. I think that, as William Watson mentioned, the stories are unforgettable. By using animals, we are brought into this story. By anthropomorphizing these animals, we then kind of see more clearly the behavior that we take as humans. And it creates an interesting tension, which is intimated also in Travis's when he talks about appealing to children and then exploring the symbolic quality of fox. Um, I also appreciate April's observations about the lyrics of Lowly Life. A little more development. What do you mean exhilarating joy and deep sorrow? Some examples from the poetry would really draw and pull out and show this tension between joy and sorrow that so much of Dunbar's work seems to intimate. I also could see in Anthony's posting the exploration of the art of fiction. Now, the characteristics of the novel that James speaks about in his piece also focus on aspects from mainstream realism that you are also seeing and working with. And I think that that is what we want to focus on as we kind of continue on into our next area. Russell's posting could have used a little bit of evidence, and you'll see that I'm noting that a lot this week. I think that you're all doing a fantastic job of engaging the postings, and I can see that you've taken to heart the observations that I gave you from last week. But I think for this week, you really do want to spend some time considering how can I show and tell my reader what I think? How can I tell on the discussion board and then show through the use of evidence what I'm actually considering? Angelica did a good job of exploring kind of the idea of biography when it came to African American, to being an African American specifically in the South, and the dialect. And that there isn't just one way to unlock it, but it really becomes more of an emblematic aspect of history than it does something that is still operating in our culture to this day. I like Stephanie's observation that realism is about everyday life, but it's making them something else. I think this is a key element that really is picked up in Colin's posting. Really kind of the connection of Harris's work and explorations were key in Colin's. And I do appreciate the connection at the end about the art of fiction in relation to Dunbar, Harris, and Chestnut. These works all do go together and can explore and connect aspects of this period too, the period between 1860 and the turn of the century. As Virgil mentioned, yes, Virgil, you are correct. African American realism does continue through World War II, and you will see this in our next week's reading when we really do focus on African American realism. I think that Sonia did a fantastic job and pulled in a lot of really good evidence. And this is what I mean by telling and showing. Tell your reader what you think, show them why they need to believe it. And I love that she mentioned wearing a mask. This idea of mask and revealing will continue to pop up in the African American tradition. As Renee also focused on, not only were these stories kind of focused and engaged, but they try to get people wrapped up into them. And they do try to get you moved in. And that's one of the reasons why dialect is brought in. Dialect really does allow you to be immersed. The other aspects, and Nika mentions this, is the use of animals to impact or to tell a story. Overall, I think Sadie's posting also presented some very key elements that were very helpful, and I appreciate the ending part with the wrap-up. Overall, I hope that you can kind of now see how each of these aspects have been working. I think fundamentally you guys have done a better job this week than last week on your discussion postings. They seem to be more robust, have a sense of reflection and relation to the overview while engaging the literature. I also appreciate that you're responding to each other with a good level of thought and a good level of balance. Remember, the discussion boards are where we are making the bulk of our understanding, and so I appreciate the work that you are doing. For for this week, which it is Monday, we are going to be reading for week 2, Naturalism and African American Literature Part 2. If you select week 3 under assignments, you're going to see the readings and the podcast. And the podcast is something that you can watch. It is about Kate Chopin, and it'll allow you a little bit of information. We are reading Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper and Why I Wrote the Yellow Wallpaper, as well as Crane's The Open Boat, Up from Slavery, and Du Bois. You'll note that we're not reading Kate Chopin, although Kate Chopin is part of the naturalism tradition and also one of the predominant, I guess you'd say the preeminent or first writers of kind of quasi-feminist literature, much like Charlotte Perkins Gilman. You will also note under the discussion board that we are going to be discussing, naturalism and African American literature. The overview, just like you've done before, is right here, and then you can go right into the posting. If you do have any questions as you're going through this, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to chit-chat with you about aspects of the course, and next week we'll really dig into some literary thoughts and movements. Thank you guys so much for your attention, and I look forward to seeing your posts.